Hello, my name is Charles Russell, and this is part of a series I'm doing on JavaScript. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about data types. Now, in the previous video I did on variables, I, at the end, talked about how JavaScript is a weakly typed language, but that doesn't mean that it's untyped. JavaScript is really type aware. Now, unlike other languages, which have a whole bunch, like 20, 30 data types, these are things like Java, C++, PHP. There are only 6 in JavaScript. These 6 are Boolean, number, string, null, undefined, and object. Now, it's often useful to know what type of object is contained in the variable. And JavaScript provides a tool to do that. It's called the typeof operator. And its syntax is just like what you see there. You have typeof val, where val is the variable you're trying to check the type of. It behaves as you would expect, and you can see how it behaves in this table. This is right out of the ECMA standard. This is table 20 out of the ECMA standard. And like I said, just as you would expect, everything comes back, with the exception of one piece of weirdness, and that is the null data type. Now, I just said that null is its own data type. It is a primitive. It's actually defined as a primitive in Chapter 8. Now, the only reason that typeof returns an object on null is because that's what the standard says. That table came right out of that standard. Now, to me, this is a mistake. And to a lot of other people, it's a mistake. And I've seen a lot of discussions arguing back and forth why it isn't. The best short explanation I have seen of why the typeof returns null, object on null, is from Kiro Risk. And here's what he says. The reasoning behind this is that null, in contrast with undefined, was, and still is, often used where objects appear. In other words, null is often used to signify an empty reference to an object. When Brendan Eich created JavaScript, he followed the same paradigm. And it makes sense, arguably, to return object. In fact, ECMA's script specification defines null as the primitive value that represents the intentional absence of any object value. In my mind, this is any value at all. Now, this is a quote from his blog, and you can find Kiro's blog at kiro.me/blog/typeof_null.html. So, as we just discussed, the null is the intentional absence of any value, and it is its own data type. The data type null can contain only one value, null. Any variable that is set to null is not the same as having an undefined variable. It means just that the variable is designed but has no value. So really, what is an undefined variable then? Well, this is cut and pasted directly out of the ECMA standard. The undefined type has exactly one value called undefined. Any variable that has not been assigned a value has the value undefined. So if I say variable equals undefined, then that variable ceases to exist completely. If I say variable equals null, that variable is still defined, it still exists, but it is empty. Now we're going to get off and go a little bit different tack than what you would do in most languages when you teach a course in them. We're going to leave the simple data types for a moment and talk about the complex data type of object. And I'll explain why in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about objects. In JavaScript, everything that is not a primitive type that we're going to be discussing here throughout the rest of this video and the next are primitive data types. But they have certain properties and methods. Properties are characteristics, methods, or actions. Now I want you to remember that anything that is not a primitive type is an object. That is an important concept that I really need you to remember, because later on, especially when we talk functions, that's going to become real important. Now in JavaScript, unlike other languages, the objects are dynamic, which means you can change them, extend them, and modify them at runtime. This is very different from the classical languages like Java and PHP. Objects can have any value that you want to give them, with one exception: undefined. Representing, they're usually representing a object, usually done in name-value pairs, and a new operator will give you a new object with all the corresponding properties set to nothing. So you have an empty object. In this case, I saw my slide shows a capital N. New should be lowercase n, just to note, just as a note. Now, here's the reason why I discussed objects a little bit first and do this little introduction. We will get a lot more into objects further into the course, but I just want to give you a little update. The reason is that for primitive data types that we're going to discuss throughout this whole section of this video and the next on data types have wrapper objects around them. These wrapper objects have properties and methods. This is not the primitive data type. When you do a type on these wrappers, you're going to get back object. But if you do a set of literal, then you're going to actually get back the actual primitive data type. So when you do a type, you'll get the typeof will give you back the data type that it is. So let's talk about the first of these data types with the wrappers. And that's Booleans. Boolean, unlike the undefined and null, can have either one of two values. These values can be true or false. Now, the Boolean object, the wrapper object that associates with this, has two methods: toString and valueof. ToString I will discuss a little bit further when we talk about strings, but let's discuss valueof right here and now. Valueof is going to return back the primitive value inside the object. In this case, you will either get true or false. Now, in objects, there's a concept of something called a constructor, which I will get into in a lot more detail later. It is I've seen it referred to as a property or a method. To me, it's a method. What the constructor does is it makes the object. And you can set this object to have a default primitive value. So if I say new Boolean and I pass in, say, something that says a thing I just passed in as a string, it's going to actually try to figure out a string that I just passed in as a variable, as a type Boolean. So how does it do it? Well, it's not true or false. We can't call it true or false. So let's call it falsy and truthy. So falsy values, other than the actual true Boolean false that we've already discussed, can be 0 or -0. If you pass that number in, or a variable with that value in, you're going to get back, it's going to be, your Boolean object's going to be set to false. If it's an empty string, in other words, a string with no characters inside of it, that will also return false, as will the null, anything that's null data type, and something called nan, which is a special thing around numbers. We'll discuss nan shortly in the next video. Everything else in the language is truthy, including the strings containing 0 and the strings containing false. This is not the same as setting something to 0 or false. So that's as far as I'm going to go in this video, because I need to kind of split it in half. In the next video, we're going to get into we're going to get into numbers, and we're going to get into the math object, and we're going to talk a little bit about strings and their methods and properties. So until then, I'll see you on the next video, and enjoy. Hope you're getting something out of this series. Thank you.